A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
Well, the UK is about to have an election and we are joined by Vicky Gibbens. She is a news and current affairs editor at UCB in Europe, based in Stoke-on-Trent in Old Blighty, England. Vicky, welcome.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Vicky, talk us through it. What is going on right now in the UK leading up to this election?
Well, it's all been happening. So we've had about 6 weeks of election campaigning, and that's involved loads of speeches, letters, postings, hustings, community events, as well as quite a number of TV debates as well. And you've got to remember that the Conservatives have been in power since 2010. So we're talking 14 years. And in that time, we've had a referendum on Scottish independence. That was rejected. Then also a referendum on Brexit. And that finally happened at the start of 2020, and the vote obviously was back in 2016, and that caused quite significant division actually within the Tories themselves. And then of course 2020, well, that also brought COVID, which impacted all of us globally, but also here in the UK, it brought a number of political scandals involving the Tories, and ultimately that led to Boris Johnson, a well-known name. He stepped down as Prime Minister back in 2022. And that was the year that was quite iconic in British politics because we ended up with 3 Prime Ministers. So we had Boris Johnson, then we had Liz Truss, who had a budget that many blamed for causing further misery with the UK economy, as well as our mortgages. Obviously, many of us experiencing a cost of living crisis. And then we ended up with the current Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak. And he called this election about 6 weeks ago.
So what was his motive? Why is he calling an election? Is it that he had to, or is he just feeling like he's losing control of his party? What's going on?
Yeah, well, I mean, the pressure was on Rishi Sunak. The questions were being asked as to when he was going to call this election. He had actually until January 2025 in terms of our parliamentary term to make that decision. But then he went for it about 6 weeks ago, rain-soaked outside Downing Street, saying that there would be election on the 4th of July, and very much pointing towards what was happening with the UK economy, feeling like we were turning a corner. But in reality, Labour has pretty much had one word to sum up their campaign, and that has been change. They've lost the last 4 elections, but now many of the opinion polls say Labour are on course for a landslide win. Whilst Rishi Sunak says he's absolutely not given up, the Prime Minister says the decision of a small number of voters could prevent a huge Labour majority.
This is an important election, and in spite of what some people want others to believe, that it's all a foregone conclusion, every vote matters, particularly if you want to prevent a Labour supermajority, you want your taxes cut and your pension protected. The only way to do that is to vote Conservative.
Yeah, Andrew, in contrast, the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, he's been warning Labour voters not to rely on the party's huge poll lead. He wants to ensure he gets a really strong mandate.
We are asking for the opportunity to change our country for the better and put it back in the service of working people. That is what this is all about. And the contrast could not be starker.
Wow. One of the commentators in Australia, Vicky, actually said this election almost seems upside down to us here in Australia because it seems like the Labor leader, who's supposedly the progressive, seems to come from the establishment, and the Conservative leader seems to come from someone who almost seems like a progressive from his background, a recent migrant. Have you got any comments about that?
Well, a lot has been asked of Sir Keir Starmer in terms of who exactly is he. Coming into this election, there were many question marks about what he actually stood for. Standing in opposition, he's made a number of U-turns on different policies. And so in his manifesto, there were a phenomenal amount of pictures of him first and foremost to make sure that voters knew exactly what he looks like. But also he's been out on the campaign trail trying to make some of his backstory and personal history known to voters as well. Obviously, that has been making a difference in terms of what we've been seeing with the opinion polls too.
Yeah, and here's the $1 million question. So as a Conservative leader, is he resonating with the Christian faith communities of Great Britain. Are people identifying with the Conservative Party, or are they feeling disillusionment and frustration with them?
Well, we have been asking across the home nations, so that's England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, how people are feeling within church communities as we approach this election. And I can bring you some of their voices.
Don't trust them. That's the basic thing.
Policies show no real differences. It just seems to be a lot of point scoring between political parties to me.
I think a number of party leaders or politicians at the moment actually fit the description of a follower rather than a leader. I think looking for integrity.
I consider party political leaders important, but I'm concerned that we're heading towards more of a presidential view of politics here instead of individual representatives and what they stand for.
So many Christians are actually concerned more about the policies rather than the leaders themselves. And we've seen dominating key election issues, the NHS, healthcare here in the UK, also migration, the cost of living crisis. And within some church communities, they said there's not been enough discussion about gender identity, around abortion, and of course, end-of-life assisted suicide has been a hot topic in recent years within the UK Parliament.
So would it be fair to say that Christians are growing a little bit disillusioned with the Conservative Party? Obviously, they're probably disillusioned with the more progressive Labor Party as well.
I think it's the broader UK context. There has been some frustration with a number of the political scandals we've seen in recent years. I mean, in the past few weeks, both the main parties during this election period alone have been caught up in investigations into alleged betting on the general election as well. You've got to remember that it's not just about the Conservatives and Labour. We've got a number of smaller parties, the Liberal Democrats, Reform UK, the Greens, SNP and Plaid Cymru. The familiar complaint remains about the first-past-the-post system for those parties, whilst they are expected to pick up a bigger share of the overall vote in this election compared to previous ones because of some of the issues with the two main parties. But in some constituencies, it's still harder to convert those votes into parliamentary seats because of the spread of support across England, Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland.
Now, in the UK, as in America, you don't have compulsory voting. Us former colonials, we're forced to vote by a government, and if we don't vote, we actually have to pay a fine, and that's the reason every Aussie votes. But what's the sense in the UK right now? Is there a real sense of everyone wanting to vote and wanting to have their say in this election, or do you feel there's also just a little bit of lethargy with amongst some people who just can't be bothered?
The feeling on the ground is that perhaps at times people have been dipping in and out of what's been happening with the election campaign. As I say, some of the pledges and the promises hasn't been what's dominating some of the debate among potential voters. It has been those betting allegations. Also, a number of Reform UK candidates defecting to the Tories amid a racism row, including undercover footage revealing one activist making a racial slur against the Prime Minister. And some of those individual incidents perhaps dominating debate rather than necessarily just the key election issues. But we'll have to wait and see. Polling stations, of course, open from 7 a.m. until 10 o'clock. It's a new one for us that we have to bring voter ID. And another question mark these past few days has been about what's been going on with our postal votes, because there have been allegations that for some of us who were expecting to receive a postal vote, they haven't come through our door mailboxes. And of course, some political parties asking for a review. Royal Mail saying there hasn't been a backlog in the system.
Yeah, interesting. I can't believe that there's betting allegations made about an election. It's almost comedy, isn't it? I mean, do you think there's any substance to those allegations?
I think in the longer term, there probably will be some kind of a review around parliamentary behaviour and what is actually acceptable. Among the public, there has been quite a reaction negatively around what's been happening with these allegations. But at the moment, investigations with the Gambling Commission and the police are being carried out.
Yeah, it's almost as bad. You wouldn't remember this, but in the 1970s, the Australian cricket team were playing at Lords, I think, and England was so far behind, the odds were 500 to 1 for them to win, and some of the Australian fielders and bowlers actually placed a few bets on England winning, and England actually ended up winning that test, and that was a bit of a scandal back in the day. But Yeah, I'm struggling to even fathom politicians actually betting on an election that they're involved in. And, I'll just tell you, across the Western world, there's a real perception here that the establishment in all the political circles, regardless of which party they represent, are no longer representing the common person, and there's a real frustration in Australia. I know Americans are feeling the same frustration, and I think that's why we saw Trump win that election in 2016, that the average person just really feels like both the major parties and all of our major democracies now just don't represent the common person anymore. Would you say that's the feeling in the UK as well?
I think one of the issues for the average person has been the cost of living, and perhaps how your key leaders are going to be responding to that going forward as well. But we've had leaders across the church denominations, whilst perhaps not politically speaking, very much being active in promoting and encouraging us to go out and use our vote and to have our say.
Yeah, and this cost of living crisis, I can tell you, it's not just limited to the UK. We have it in Australia. We had a caller call in on our Talkback show just yesterday saying that their neighbour, an elderly retiree who's worked his whole life, paid taxes his whole life, the lights were out for about 2 weeks, and they were concerned this elderly neighbour had passed away. And they finally knocked on the door just to inquire about their welfare. And the elderly guy said, I can't afford to put the lights on anymore at night because I'm just struggling to pay bills. And this is a man who worked his whole life, paid taxes his whole life. And so we also are experiencing a cost of living crisis here in Australia. And I think I'm hearing it all around the world. Even in America, the cost of everything's gone up. So it's not just limited to the UK. It's almost like the whole world is being gripped in this cost of living crisis at the moment.
And it's so many churches who are responding at a grassroots level. We've had churches putting up banners around issues to do with poverty and the food banks that they're running, and really campaigning and asking politicians across the political spectrum to respond to the issue rather than it just being a burden that they're shouldering.
Yeah, and it is an opportunity for the church, isn't it, to step up and provide welfare and assistance to the poor, and we're seeing that in Australia as well, I'm sure. You're seeing it in the UK. But Vicky Gibbens, I want to thank you so much. That's a really comprehensive report. Thanks for filling us in on what's happening there. We will be watching eagerly here from your former colony in Australia, and maybe we can get an update from you next week once a winner is declared in this UK federal election. But Vicky Gibbens, the news and current affairs editor from UCB Europe, I want to thank you for joining us on 2020 Today.
My pleasure, Andrew. Have a great day.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.